In the scorching emptiness of the North African desert, where the horizon melted into waves of trembling heat and the sand seemed to stretch into infinity, British soldiers moved cautiously, every step feeling like a whisper against a landscape that swallowed all sound. The desert was not simply a place. It was a ruthless, breathing enemy that crushed hope beneath its burning winds and frozen nights. Above them, German reconnaissance planes swept the sky with hawk-like precision, their shadows gliding over the dunes like silent threats. Every footprint in the sand, every metallic glint from a tank, every stray movement risked revealing their position to the ever-watchful Luftwaffe. The British commanders knew that brute force alone would never win this unforgiving battlefield. If they wanted to survive, they needed brilliance, something so unexpected, so unthinkably deceptive, that it could confuse even the sharpest enemy eyes. In this hostile environment, where steel and fire meant little without strategy, the foundation of an extraordinary idea began to form. It would be an idea born not from military doctrine, but from imagination bold enough to challenge death itself. And so, in the silence of the desert, a miracle of deception was waiting to be born. In dimly lit tents scattered across the British camp, strange men gathered, artists, architects, set designers, sculptors, and painters who once lived their lives behind theater curtains and studio walls. Now, those same hands that painted backdrops and built festival structures were recruited to protect thousands of soldiers with nothing more than creativity. Maps lay open, pencils scribbled wildly, and ideas that sounded like illusions from a magic show were suddenly treated like strategic proposals. What if tanks could vanish? What if the deadliest machines of war could be disguised as harmless trucks? What if the entire desert became a stage, and the Germans became an audience fooled by the performance? These wild questions were no longer jokes. They became the blueprint for a new kind of warfare. The British realized that in a desert where nothing could hide, the only solution was to hide in plain sight. And so, imagination sharpened itself into a weapon more powerful than bullets, giving birth to a deception unit unlike anything the world had ever seen. The idea of the Sunshield emerged from those frantic brainstorming sessions, rising like a spark of genius in a world suffocated by war. It was a deceptively simple structure, lightweight wooden frames wrapped in canvas sheets painted in sandy desert tones. When opened, the frame covered a tank from every angle, making it appear to be nothing more than a supply truck to anyone looking down from the sky. The brilliance wasn't just in the disguise but in the audacity of believing it could work at all. Soldiers crawled beneath the canvas as it folded neatly over their massive war machines, transforming deadly steel into harmless shapes. The sun bounced off the neutral colors, blending the illusions seamlessly into the desert. German pilots, flying high above, would see only an ordinary convoy of slow, insignificant transport vehicles. Hidden beneath those wooden skeletons, British armored divisions quietly prepared to change the course of the war. This was not camouflage. This was art meeting war, illusion meeting survival. Day and night, workshops roared with activity as hammers struck lumber, sawdust floated through the air, and paintbrushes swept across canvas panels with strokes of genius. Hundreds of sunshields were built with precise calculations to withstand the blazing sun, desert winds, and rough tank movements. Artists tested different shades, making sure the covers matched the desert's shifting colors, from the pale yellow at sunrise to the dark gold near sunset. Soldiers practiced assembling and disassembling the frames in minutes, perfecting a choreographed routine that allowed tanks to disappear and reappear like ghosts. The illusion army grew silently, each wooden frame more refined than the last. What began as a desperate idea had transformed into a full-scale invisible force. Every sunshield was more than a disguise. It was a symbol of hope, a promise that creativity could outsmart even the most feared German eyes watching from above. When the first convoy of disguised tanks rolled across the dunes, a heavy silence fell upon the soldiers who watched anxiously. The tanks rumbled beneath their flimsy wooden covers, and men held their breath, unsure if this bold experiment would hold up under real conditions. Overhead, the sound of German aircraft engines grew louder as they approached, scanning the sands for any hint of British armor. The soldiers froze, eyes locked on the sky, waiting for the moment when everything would collapse. But nothing happened. The plane circled, observed, and flew away uninterested, fooled entirely by the carefully crafted illusions below. The disguised tanks rolled on, unnoticed, unchallenged, untouched. The impossible had become reality. The British had created a ghost army. The success of the Sunshield on its first test changed the atmosphere in the camp. For the first time in months, there was pride, excitement, and a spark of confidence that the tides of war could indeed be turned using nothing but brilliance. General Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, was renowned for predicting enemy moves with uncanny accuracy. He understood the desert better than most men understood their own homes. His instincts were sharp, his strategies brilliant, and his confidence unshakable. But now something was wrong. Reports from German scouts were strange and inconsistent. Reconnaissance photos showed no British tanks where they should have been, only harmless trucks. Yet, later on the battlefield, tanks would appear in places no one had spotted them traveling through. Rommel's mind raced, trying to solve a puzzle without pieces. His grip on the desert was slipping, not because British numbers increased, but because British visibility decreased. Unknown to him, the British had changed the rules of warfare entirely. They weren't just hiding tanks, they were hiding truth itself. Rommel was facing an enemy he couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't understand. With early success fueling their ambition, the British deception team expanded their creativity beyond the Sunshield. They designed rubber tanks so light that 3 men could lift them, wooden artillery pieces that looked deadly from afar, and entire fake camps made from painted cloth stretched over poles. They created phantom pipelines, shadow airfields, and dummy trucks lined neatly to mimic massive supply routes. Soldiers were trained not only to fight but to act, moving props, rearranging fake vehicles, and creating false patterns for German scouts to analyze. The desert battlefield became a living theater of illusions, each trick more elaborate than the last. The British were no longer simply hiding their strength, they were manufacturing false strength to mislead the enemy entirely. And with every deceptive creation, the German command sank deeper into confusion. In the days leading up to Operation Crusader, the British camp buzzed with both fear and anticipation. The success of the mission depended entirely on whether the Germans continued believing the lies woven across the sands. Real tanks hid under sunshields like lions crouching beneath cloth, waiting for the moment to shed their disguises. German patrol aircraft flew overhead, but each time they observed only weak, harmless transport units. They had no idea that just below the canvas lay hundreds of tons of armored firepower ready to break through their lines. British commanders reviewed their plans under dim lantern light, knowing that one mistake, one shadow, one reflection, one misplaced sunshield could expose the entire operation. Yet, in that tension, there was also a quiet confidence. For the first time, the British were not reacting, they were controlling the battlefield through invisible hands. As the sun rose on the day of Operation Crusader, the desert glowed like molten gold. Then, suddenly, the silence shattered. Sunshields dropped to the sand like collapsing wings, and beneath them emerged steel beasts roaring with life. British tanks surged forward, engines thundering as they ripped across the dunes with unstoppable force. German soldiers stared in shock. These tanks had come from nowhere. Their maps were wrong. Their intelligence was useless. Their air reconnaissance had betrayed them. What they thought were trucks mere hours earlier had transformed into armored divisions tearing into their defenses. Confusion rippled across Rommel's forces as officers scrambled to understand what had gone wrong. But it was too late. The illusion had already done its job. The hidden army had revealed itself, and the desert shook under the weight of its advance. The sudden appearance of British armor hit the Germans like a thunderstorm striking dry earth. Rommel's lines weakened rapidly as his troops struggled to reposition against an enemy that had seemingly materialized out of thin air. What began as disbelief turned into chaos, and what turned into chaos quickly became forced retreat. Command posts crackled with panic. Maps were rewritten. Positions abandoned. Everything the Germans believed about British movements was proven false in a matter of hours. The psychological blow was devastating, far stronger than any bombardment. The British had not just attacked, they had humiliated the enemy's intelligence network. And as their tanks pushed deeper into the desert, morale soared like never before. For the first time, the British felt truly in control of the North African War. Rumors began to spread across German units, whispers of tanks that could hide themselves, of vehicles that changed shape, of an enemy that seemed to vanish into the sand. Fear crawled through the German ranks as soldiers began questioning every shadow, every distant dust cloud, every harmless-looking truck. Meanwhile, British troops, once uncertain about the Sunshield idea, now carried a renewed sense of pride. They had taken an impossible concept and turned it into a weapon strong enough to alter the course of battle. Their invisible movements, once seen as desperation, were now symbols of brilliance. They marched forward with the confidence of soldiers who had outsmarted a legendary enemy not with numbers, but with creativity. Behind the scenes of this battlefield success stood men who had never imagined themselves as warriors. Painters who once decorated theaters now painted lifelike desert shadows on canvas. Sculptors who once carved festival statues now shaped wooden structures to hide tanks. These unlikely heroes found themselves fighting a war with imagination instead of bullets. They crafted illusions with passion, knowing each brushstroke could save a soldier's life. Their workshops became as important as any command center. Every sunshield, every fake artillery piece, every rubber tank they built became a silent weapon. They were the unseen hands behind a victory forged not by destruction, but by deception. Their contribution proved that creativity could be as powerful as courage. As the desert winds swept across the abandoned German position, a strange mixture of fear, shock, and disbelief filled their retreating ranks, for no one could understand how an entire armored brigade had appeared out of nowhere in a landscape that had been completely exposed only a day earlier. Long after the battle ended, many German soldiers whispered among themselves that the British must have received supernatural help or possessed technology far beyond anything the Axis powers had imagined at the time. What they didn't know, and what they could not possibly have guessed, was that the truth was far simpler yet infinitely more brilliant. The British had turned the very weakness of the desert into a weapon. Deception, illusion, and shadow had become their strongest allies. The story of the tanks that were not tanks, the trucks that were not trucks, and the shadows that were not shadows began spreading through German ranks like wildfire, confusing analysts, frustrating reconnaissance teams, and even forcing Rommel to rethink his assumptions about British capability and intelligence gathering. It was the first time the Desert Fox felt truly blinded, unable to rely on the sharp instincts that had helped him dominate the desert until that moment. British commanders listened quietly as reports from German prisoners revealed their confusion, realizing that their plan had succeeded far beyond what they had hoped for. A whisper of British ingenuity had now turned into a roaring legend, one that would continue to echo across the dunes for years to come. As British commanders stood over the newly captured high ground 122, a subtle but powerful shift could be felt across the entire theater of war, because this victory was not simply another point on a map nor just another defensive line secured. It was proof that strategy, imagination, and psychological warfare could achieve what brute force often failed to accomplish. Soldiers who had once doubted the odd-looking fabric shields, strange wooden frames, and hastily assembled decoys now looked at them with genuine respect, as if these humble constructions had become silent heroes of their own. The engineers who crafted them felt a rare pride, knowing that their creativity had saved countless lives and rewritten the expectations of modern warfare. Commanders who once argued that deception was secondary now saw it as one of the most lethal tools in the entire arsenal. The battlefield itself seemed transformed. Where once the scorch of failure loomed, now a new sense of momentum spread through British ranks, giving them the confidence to push forward. Reports sent back to London celebrated the victory, but what they could not fully capture was the psychological impact, the breath of hope, the restoration of courage among thousands of troops who had been waiting for a sign that the tide would finally turn. This was not just a triumph of arms, it was the triumph of imagination over fear. In the months and years that followed, historians, generals, and strategists studied the Sunshield operation not merely as a clever wartime trick, but as a masterclass in how human creativity can reshape the outcome of a conflict, proving that sometimes the boldest weapons are born not from factories but from minds willing to imagine the impossible. Even decades later, military academies from every corner of the world would teach the operation as a perfect example of psychological warfare, camouflage brilliance, and unconventional strategic thinking. The dunes where the deception unfolded eventually shifted with time, burying the original tracks and the remnants of sunshields beneath the ever-moving sands, but the story refused to disappear. Veterans who had witnessed the transformation of thin fabric into phantom tanks shared their memories with younger generations, ensuring that the legacy of the operation lived far beyond the battlefield itself. Every soldier who marched through North Africa carried a piece of that story with him, a story of courage born not only from strength but from imagination. The British forces learned that when hope seems lost, victory can come from the most unexpected places, even from shadows crafted by human hands. And so the desert kept its silence, but hidden beneath that silence was a tale of brilliance, daring, misdirection, and triumph, a story the world would remember long after the war had faded into history.